On the nights when one wakes up sweating about cases from the past, it's the Sutcliffe era which even now, in my 60s, I remember most clearly in the whole of my career as a forensic pathologist.
Our first withdrawal from the macabre vault is Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper. Born Peter William Sutcliffe on June 2nd, 1946, in Bingley, a market town in West Yorkshire. The oldest son of John Sutcliffe and Kathleen Coonan, he dropped out of school when he was 15 and started working various odd jobs, with one of those jobs being a gravedigger. Eventually, he trained to transport heavy goods and become a lorry driver for a company in Bradford. He married his longtime girlfriend Sonia Surma in 1974 and began his killing spree soon after. The Ripper started his killing spree on the 30th of October 1975, when the body of 28-year-old Scottish mother of four, Wilma McCann, was found near her home in the suburb of Scott Hall in Leeds. She had been hit in the head with a hammer and stabbed 15 times in her stomach, chest, and neck. Due to the viciousness of this crime, over 100 police officers were assigned to catch the killer. But from the very beginning, they showed prejudice that ended up prolonging the investigation and causing yet more murders. Truth be told, Wilma McCann was not exactly a stay-at-home mom. She was separated from her husband and would sometimes go out partying, leaving her children in the care of her eldest daughter. Since it was too early to know that her death was the work of a serial killer, police looked into her private life, thinking that the culprit may have been someone who knew her personally. They initially described her as having several boyfriends, and from there, rumors appeared that this was simply a euphemism for prostitution. The gossip was repeated by the media, and the police never really bothered to correct them. So soon enough, it became accepted as fact that Will McCann had been a prostitute, even though this had never been proven. A few months later, the killer struck again. This time the victim was 42-year-old Emily Jackson, whose body was found the morning of January the 20th, 1976, on an abandoned industrial estate in Leeds. Like Will McCann, Jackson's killer first struck her in the head with a hammer, but then he stabbed her over 50 times with a sharpened screwdriver. He then proceeded to stomp on her body with his foot. This actually gave the police their first clue regarding the identity of the killer. He belonged to a Wellington boot size 7. Despite the extreme escalation in violence, police were confident from the outset that Emily Jackson and Will McCann had been murdered by the same man. However, they also became convinced that the culprit was motivated because of his hatred for prostitutes. Sutcliffe's next victim was Irene Richardson, who lived in Leeds, West Yorkshire. She faced difficult circumstances and worked as a sex worker to support herself. Irene was known by those who knew her as a kind-hearted woman who struggled to make ends meet. She was murdered by Sutcliffe on February 5th, 1977. She was picked up by Sutcliffe and taken to Roundhay Park in Leeds. There, he attacked her with a hammer, rendering her unconscious, and then mutilated her body with a knife. Her body was found the next day in Roundhay Park. Her murder was the third in Sutcliffe's series of attacks and contributed to the growing fear and panic in the community. The brutality and randomness of the attack highlighted the urgency for law enforcement to catch the Ripper, as it became increasingly clear that anyone could be a target. And so, Sutcliffe continued on his murderous crusade. The next victim was Patricia Atkinson, aged 32, a prostitute, who became his second murder victim in 1977 at the hands of this murderous psychopath. To the police, the Leeds killer had now expanded his territory to include Bradford. Sutcliffe was driving through the grim streets of Bradford when he spotted Patricia Atkinson, very drunk and staggering as she walked, and shouted obscenities at passing cars. He stopped the car, and she jumped in without any coaxing. She told him she had a flat not far away where they could go. They then drove the short trip to Oak Lane. As he was leaving his car, Sutcliffe retrieved a claw hammer from under his seat and hid it in his coat. Once inside, he retrieved the hammer and hit her on the back of the head with a total of 4 massive blows. She fell off the bed and onto the floor. He then began hitting her with one end of the hammer and clawing her with the other end, leaving oblong marks and grazes that the pathologist, Professor David G., would describe as curious. Her lifeless body was discovered the next day by a friend. Jane MacDonald was a bright and popular teenager living in Leeds, West Yorkshire. She worked as a sales assistant at Granway Supermarket in nearby Roundhay Road and was described by those who knew her as friendly and well-liked. She lived with her family in a working-class neighborhood. She was a fan of the Bay City Rollers, and her hobbies included dancing and roller skating. At the time of her murder, she lived a few houses down from the Ripper's first victim, Wilma McCann. She was murdered by the Ripper on June 26, 1977. On the night of her murder, she had been out dancing with friends and was walking home through the Chapeltown area of Leeds when she was attacked. She planned to catch the bus to get home but missed it. She decided to go to her friend's house to wait for her sister to pick her up. When 45 minutes had passed and her sister didn't show up, she decided to walk home. Sutcliffe struck her on the head with a hammer, knocking her unconscious, and then stabbed her multiple times. Jane's body was found the next morning in a playground by children. Jane's murder was particularly shocking to the public because she was not a sex worker, unlike most of Sutcliffe's previous victims. Jane was the only victim that Sutcliffe showed sympathy for in his confessions. He claimed he thought she was a sex worker, as she was in a red light district early in the morning. Her death heightened the fear and outrage in the community, as it became clear that Sutcliffe's attacks could target any woman, not just those in vulnerable positions. Jean Jordan was a 20-year-old woman living in Manchester. Known for her resilience and determination in the face of adversity, she had moved to Manchester and worked as a sex worker in the Moss Side area to support herself and her young child. Despite the challenges she faced, she was described by those who knew her as a caring and devoted mother. On October 1st, 1977, Jean became one of the victims of Sutcliffe. He picked her up and drove her to a secluded area where he attacked her with a hammer, rendering her unconscious. He then brutally stabbed her multiple times and left her body in an allotment. While he had not forgotten his hammer, in his haste to get away undetected from the scene, he realized while driving on the M62 towards Bradford that he had left a piece of incriminating evidence which could lead the police directly to him. Several days later, he returned to her hidden corpse to retrieve the note. But after frantic, fruitless search, the Ripper's rage became uncontrollable as he finally turned his attention to the body which was almost mocking him. He began to attack the corpse, stabbing and slashing with a vengeance. The stench when her stomach blew open caused him to vomit, but he continued to attack the body. Jean Jordan's handbag was finally found at 10:00 a.m. on Saturday, October 15th, by a Mr. Cox who had gone to his allotment. A fence separated the old area from the new, and underneath this fence, concealed in long grass, he found a green leather-type handbag. The handbag had been 189 feet from where the body had been discovered. In the main compartment were makeup, cigarettes, and matches. A £5 note and a £1 note were discovered in a small side pocket on the outside of the handbag. It appeared that the handbag might have been searched, but the notes missed. The £5 note, which Peter Sutcliffe had been searching for on his return visit to Manchester, had finally been found. The incriminating note the police discovered had been from a batch issued in pay packets days before the murder. Unfortunately, the 5-day delay in its discovery, coupled with the delay caused by the fact the body had not been discovered, before Sutcliffe returned to it, and other factors, such as the delay by the police and the serial number, meant that too much time had passed to further narrow the search for its owner by any public input. Sutcliffe was interviewed about the note on November 2nd, and his seemingly strong alibi, the housewarming party on the night of the return visit, meant that he was able to escape without any suspicion that he was the Yorkshire Ripper. Helen Ritka was an 18-year-old woman living in Huddersfield, West Yorkshire, with her twin sister Rita. The sisters were close and supported each other through life's challenges. To make ends meet, Helen worked as a sex worker in the red light district of Huddersfield. Despite the difficulties she faced, Helen was known for her lively spirit and her strong bond with her sister. Tragically, on January 31st, 1978, Helen became one of Sutcliffe's victims. Sutcliffe picked her up and took her to a secluded railway yard as she made her way into the back seat of the Ripper's car. With her back to him, Sutcliffe swung his hammer, but it caught the roof of the car and only grazed Helen Ritka, who assumed he had hit her with his hand. Terrified, she said, "There is no need for that. You don't even have to pay." And then he hit her hard on the head with the hammer, and she crumbled to the ground and began making a loud moaning noise. He then dragged her to the end of the woodyard and raped her. She was the only one of his victims who he had sex with. Helen then staggered to her feet and started walking towards the car. Sutcliffe hit her on the back of the head with his hammer. He then grabbed a knife and stabbed her several times through the heart and lungs before hiding her body behind a stack of timber. Helen's body was found by a police dog on February 3rd after her sister had informed police of what the pair had been doing on the night she went missing. Vera Millward, a 40-year-old prostitute living in a rundown council flat in Hume, Manchester, was murdered by the Yorkshire Ripper 3.5 months after the killing of Helen Ritka. On May 16th, Vera, a frail, sickly woman who had one lung, had had 3 major operations and had chronic stomach pains, left her home at around 10 p.m., telling her boyfriend that she was going out to buy cigarettes. Knowing what she really meant, he did not expect to see her for a few hours. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, she had a regular client who would usually park outside her flat in Greenham Avenue and flash his car headlights. This night, he didn't show up, and Vera hung around for business with the car trade. A man driving through the area was the first client to come along. Sutcliffe and Vera drove for about 2.5 miles to the Manchester Royal Infirmary, to a quiet spot in a parking compound where prostitutes and their clients were frequently seen. After getting out of the car, Sutcliffe attacked her with his hammer. A man later claimed to have heard 3 screams for help from the hospital grounds, but decided they were from a patient at the hospital. Sutcliffe then dragged her to a spot by a fence and began to stab her with a knife. Vera Millward's body was found shortly after 8 a.m. the next morning when 6 workers arrived in 2 vans to do gardening at the Manchester Royal Infirmary. While unloading tools from the back of one of the vans, they saw what they first took to be a tailor's dummy lying near a temporary fence. As one of the men, Jim McGuigan, walked over to take a closer look, he was horrified to realize that it was the body of a dead woman. Josephine Whitaker was a 19-year-old building society clerk living in Halifax, West Yorkshire. She was described by friends and family as a bright, hard-working young woman with a promising future. She lived with her family and was well liked in her community. Josephine Whitaker was murdered by Peter Sutcliffe on April 4, 1979. She was walking home through Savile Park in Halifax when Sutcliffe attacked her. Josephine's body was found the morning after at the playing fields in Savile Park. She suffered 2 blows to the head with a hammer and was stabbed with a screwdriver 27 times in the chest, stomach, and right leg. Her murder was particularly alarming because she was not a sex worker, marking a departure from Sutcliffe's previous pattern and heightening the fear that any woman could be a target. Barbara Leach was a 20-year-old student at the University of Bradford. She was studying social psychology and lived in a shared student house in Bradford. Described as intelligent and vivacious, Barbara was well liked by her friends and had a bright future ahead of her. Barbara Leach was murdered by Peter Sutcliffe on September 1st, 1979. She was walking home from a night out with friends in the early hours when Sutcliffe attacked her in the street. Sutcliffe, driving through the area, saw her leave her group of friends and go off walking by herself. He quickly drove past her and turned left into Ash Grove. As he opened the car door to get out of the car, she was walking towards him. He let her walk past him before attacking her with a hammer from behind. He then dragged her into a backyard. He stabbed her with the same screwdriver that he had used on Josephine Whitaker, then placed her body in a distorted jackknife position behind a low wall into an area where dustbins were usually kept. He covered her body with an old piece of carpet and placed some stones on top of it. The following day at 3:55 p.m., while engaged in a police search of the area to find the missing student, Police Constable Simon Greaves found her body where Sutcliffe had hidden it in back Ash Grove, about 200 yards from where she had left her friends. Margaret Walls was murdered by Peter Sutcliffe on August 20th, 1980. Margaret was last seen leaving her office between 9:30 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. and was on her way home when Sutcliffe attacked her. Near a driveway with high stone pillars, he stunned her with a hammer blow to the back of the head, shouting, "Filthy prostitute," as he struck further blows to her head. He then looped a length of rope around her neck, tightening it as he half carried, half dragged her about 20 yards from the point of attack up the driveway and into a high-walled garden. There, while kneeling on her chest, he strangled her. After she was dead, he stripped her of all her clothing except her tights. When he left her, he partially covered the body with grass cuttings and leaves. Marguerite's body was found the following day. Her death was linked to the rest of the murders after he confessed to all 13 murders. Jacqueline Hill, age 20, a student in the third year of her English degree course, was returning home to her student's hall of residence in Headingley, Leeds, on a wet, rainy Monday, November 17th, 1980. She had been at a probation officer's seminar in Leeds city centre and had caught a bus in Cookridge Street and got off at a stop along the main Leeds-Otley Road across from the Arndale shopping centre at 9:23 p.m. She crossed the road and turned up Alma Road to walk the approximately 100 yards to her residence. Meanwhile, Peter Sutcliffe was sitting in his car parked outside the Arndale shopping centre, eating a carton of Kentucky Fried Chicken and chips. It was only 7 weeks previously that he had been at the same location and had seen Upadhyaya Bandara walk by and attacked her a quarter of a mile away. As he watched Jacqueline Hill, Sutcliffe quickly switched on the ignition and turned up Alma Road, overtaking her, stopped his car, and waited for her to walk past. After she did, he got out of the car and began to follow her for a short distance before delivering a blow to her head as she was passing an opening. Seconds later, another woman began walking down the same road, and Sutcliffe quickly hoisted his victim into a standing position before dragging her approximately 30 yards onto some spare land behind the Arndale. There he pulled her clothes off and stabbed her with a yellow-handled screwdriver, repeatedly in the chest and once in the eye. It was not until the following morning that her body was discovered by Donald Court, a manager of a shop at the Arndale shopping centre, who, while walking along a ramp leading to a car park, glanced over the wall and saw the body. Jacqueline Hill was the last known victim of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. Ultimately, Sutcliffe was arrested in the city of Sheffield. He was sitting in a car with a sex worker, Olivia Rivers, when police spotted his fake license plates. After he was taken into custody, police discovered screwdrivers in Sutcliffe's car, which resulted in a search that uncovered a hammer and knife he stashed near the scene of his arrest. He'd gotten a private moment to do so by telling officers he needed to relieve himself. During his interrogation, Sutcliffe confessed to the crimes, saying, "It's all right. I know what you're leading up to. The Yorkshire Ripper. It's me. I killed all those women." Sutcliffe's trial began on May 4th, 1981. Although he'd confessed to being the Yorkshire Ripper after his January arrest, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter in court and not guilty to murder, claiming diminished responsibility, akin to a plea of temporary insanity in the United States. Sutcliffe shared that he'd killed sex workers due to his belief that he was on a divine mission. Sutcliffe's plea of diminished responsibility, which could have resulted in a lighter sentence, wasn't successful. He was found guilty of 13 murders and 7 counts of attempted murder. The judge sentenced him to 20 life terms and recommended a minimum sentence of 30 years. The death penalty wasn't an option, having been abolished in 1965.